Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chel Gimel, and we'll be learning today, Mitzvah Hashem, Tav Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos, and we pick up today. We are in Siman Reish Nun Gimel. We're still in the middle of Sif Aleph, so this is really going to be share number 3 for Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, and we've been discussing the halachas of Shehiyah. We'll give a brief recap in a moment. Our learning should be as close for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanisunim Batzoru Bashivya, Haimnim Bein Bayam Bein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yirachem Aleihem V'Yitzim Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu L'Oira U'Mishiva L'Geula Hashta Bagolo V'Zman Kariv V'Naimar Amen. Our learning should be a schos Refuah Shalema for David Ben Blima, and our learning should also be a schos for a dear friend of mine who is going through a tzara. He has a very, very important day tomorrow. He's awaiting a decision, and Mirz Hashem, the Rebbeinu Shem, should have Rachmanis on him, and he should be zeichet to the Yeshua and the Hatzalah that he needs. So, here in Siman Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, we've been discussing the halacha of Shehiyah. What's the halacha that we've seen so far? Well, we've been discussing a kira. If you remember, we said that a kira is a type of oven that they had back in the day. It was an oven and a cooktop. So if you imagine a large inverted pot that's sitting on the ground, inside is where you put the fuel. Up on top, in essence, you have a stovetop where there's room to put 2 kederos. There's room to put 2 pots up on top. The Mechaber told us, if you have a kira, and the kira is fueled with gefes or eitzim. Gefes, we said, is the psoilus, the waste material from crushed olives. So you have olive skins, olive pits, etc., etc. Eitzim is pshuta kamashmai. Eitzim is wood. But it doesn't matter exactly if it's gefes, eitzim, but if the kira is fueled with substances, with fuels that turn into coals, then the Chachamim made an Isser of Shehiyah. What's the Isser of Shehiyah? You're not allowed to take food and put it on top of the stovetop on Erev Shabbos and let it sit there on Shabbos so that it should be hot on Shabbos. That's the Maisa of Shehiyah. Shehiyah is to put something on the stovetop on Erev Shabbos, and you want to leave it there going into Shabbos. Why is there an Isser of Shehiyah? There's an Isser of Shehiyah because we're afraid that if you put food onto the stovetop on Erev Shabbos and you leave it on a hot stove on Shabbos and there's fuel that turned into coals, there's a chashash, there's a concern, shema yechata begecholim. You might come to stoke the coals on Shabbos. Why? In order to make the fire hotter and to accelerate the cooking process, and by stoking the coals, you would be over an Issa Daraisa of Havara, and very possibly an Issa Daraisa also of Bishul, because you're accelerating the cooking process. So that's the problem of Shehiyah. Having said that, there are great exceptions to this rule. So when is Shehiyah Aser? Shehiyah is Aser whenever there's a reason to believe that you might come to be Mechata B'Gecholim. Now, why would you be Mechata B'Gecholim? Well, let's say the food is only partially cooked, and you're counting on that food for the Friday night Suda. So then we could very easily understand Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim. You're worried, I'm not going to have my chicken soup for the Friday night Suda. You might be Mechata B'Gecholim to accelerate the cooking process. So partially cooked food, that's right away a problem. You can't do Shehiyah with partially cooked food. But what if the food is already mavushal kol tzarchai? What if the food is already fully cooked? So then we saw there's still a concern of shemi yechata begecholim if, although it's fully cooked, it's mitztamek v'yofeloi. If continued cooking is going to kind of dry it up, shrivel it up, but that's going to be a mila, if that's going to be good for the food. The example that I like to use, even though it's talking about cholent, is people like a dry cholent. Some people like a soupy cholent, but some people like a dry cholent. So even though the cholent might be mavushal kol tzarchai, but if the continued cooking would be mitztamek v'yofeloi. Sometimes you have a brisket. A brisket might be fully cooked. It might be 200 degrees. But brisket, the tissue of the brisket breaks down even further. The hotter it gets, the internal temperature, and it gets softer and softer. So brisket might be mitztamik v'yafaloi. If something is mitztamik v'yafaloi, again, there's a concern, shema yechata b'gecholim. But what if you have food that's mevushal kol tzarchai and it's mitztamik v'raloi? If it's mevushal kol tzarchai and continued cooking is going to be detrimental to the quality of the food, then we don't have a concern, shema yechata b'gecholim. Why on earth would you be mechata b'gecholim? Why would you stoke the coals if it's mitztamik v'raloi? You don't want to make the food worse. So, you have a kira, you have fuel in the kira that turned into coals, but if you have food that's mevushal kol tzarchai and mitztamik v'raloi, you could do shehiyah, no problem. There's no concern, shema yechata b'gecholim. But if it's either partially cooked or it's fully cooked by mitztamik v'yafaloi, then there's an isser of shehiyah. We also saw another way to circumvent the isser d'Rabbanan of shehiyah is if the food that you're putting on the fire is completely raw. If you want to do shehiyah, if you want to put food on that stovetop on Erev Shabbos and leave it into Shabbos, but when you put it on right before Shabbos, it's completely raw, then again there's no concern of shema yechata b'gecholim. Why? Because you have no expectation to use this food Friday night at all. So why would you be mechata b'gecholim? You're not in a rush to accelerate the cooking. By tomorrow, it's going to be cooked. For tonight, not negeya. I'm not going to use it tonight. So if it's fully raw, there's no problem of shehiyah, because there's no concern, shema yechata b'gecholim. We also saw, let's say you do have food that's partially cooked, so there would be a concern of shema yechata b'gecholim, and you want to get away from it. Very simple. Take a piece of meat, raw meat, throw it in right before Shabbos. Now we treat the whole pot as if it's raw, and again, there's no concern, shema yechata b'gecholim, and there's no gezerah against shehiyah, there's no isser shehiyah d'Rabbanan. We also saw grufa ukituma. Let's say you have this kira, but you did grifa. What's grifa? You swept out all the coals. If you swept out all the coals, there can't be a concern, shema yechata b'gecholim, there are no coals. Or you did kitima. What's kitima? You banked the coals with ash. You threw ash over the coals. By throwing ash over the coals, right away you're being memayet the choim. You're lessening the heat of the coals. When you do a maisa to lessen the heat of the coals, you're doing something that's megale. It's a gilui milsa. You're showing that you're no longer interested in the intense heat of the coals. If you do a ma'aseh of ketima, we're no longer worried, shema yechata b'gecholim. We're not worried that you're going to do an about face, and now on Shabbos you might be mechata b'gecholim. So this is another way to get around the isser of shehiyah, is with grufa uketuma. If the kira is grufa uketuma, then there's no isser of shehiyah. Lastly, we saw that if the kira is not fueled with gefes ve'etzim, if it's not fueled with fuel that turns into coals, if it's fueled with kash, with stubble, givava, straw, stubble, these are things that ignite, they burn up, and then they're gone. So there are no coals to be mechata. So the Mechaber told us, by a kira, if you have a kira that's fueled with kash ugivava, then there's no isser shehiyah, and it doesn't even have to be grufa uktuma. The fuel could actually still be in the kira. Why? Because there is no being mechata b'gecholim by kasher givava. It burns up and it's gone. There's nothing to stoke. So there's never a concern of shema yechata b'gecholim. One halacha that I failed to mention that we learned already was the concept of being masmich. We've been talking about shehiyah, where you're taking food and you're putting it on the stovetop. How about putting it next to the stovetop? So the Mechaber told us that by a kira, you're allowed to be masmich a kedera. You're allowed to take a kedera of food, a pot of food, and you're allowed to put it on the ground next to the kira, even if it's fueled with gefes and eitzim, and even if it's not grufa ukituma. You're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to put the pot, and you're allowed to do this even if the food is not fully cooked. Like the Mishnah Berurah said on Chaf Amud Beis and Ois Cotton Design, this is mutter even if it's not cooked Kamachal Ben Drusai. So you're dealing with food that's not really cooked. You could put it next to the kedera, on the ground, next to the, I'm sorry, not the kedera. You could put the kedera, you could put the pot of the food next to the kira, even though the kira is not grufu ktuma. Why is that mutter? The reason it's mutter is because we're not worried, Shemi Yechat to B'Gechalim, because stoking the coals that are inside the kira are not going to help the pot that's next to the kedera. So there is no isser of shehiyah if you want to be masmich next to the kira. Okay, we needed this whole recap because now we're building onto what we've seen. Now we begin on Chaf Aleph, Amud Aleph, top line near the end of the line, where the Mechaber now is going to turn to a different type of oven. So until now we're talking about a kira. Okay, a kira is a somewhat large oven with a large stovetop surface on top where there's room for 2 pots. Now, because of its size, it doesn't build up intense heat. Now, the Mechaber turns to a tanur. Says the Mechaber, v'tanur. How about what they called back in the day a tanur? What's a tanur? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Chaf Aleph. V'tanur, hainu b'tanur shalahem. This is a reference to the type of tanur that they had back in the time of the Mechaber. Sha'asuyos kikira. It was essentially constructed the same way as a kira. Again, it was like an inverted pot that had room inside and the bottom for fuel and space on top to like a cooktop. But mitoich shekitzarois lamayla. The way a tanur was constructed is it was angled. It was narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. Now we know heat rises. So you have the fuel in the wide bottom, and you have the heat rising up to the narrow top, and up on top, you have room for a pot. Because of the shape of this tanur, you get an intense buildup of heat underneath where you want to put the pot. And that's going to make a very big difference. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu b'tanur shalahem sha'asuyos kikira. Essentially, it's constructed the same way as a kira. However, mitoich shekitzarois lamayla, since they're very narrow at the top, v'rachav lamata, and they're wide at the bottom, niklat chumay l'soichai, the heat gets trapped inside up at the top, tfei mikira, more than the kira. You get a greater buildup of heat, more intense heat. Lakach, therefore, hechmiru by yoser mikira. The tanur is more chamur. We treat it more stringently than we treat a kira. So now let's take a look at what the halacha is by a tanur. Let's see what the Mechaber says. The tanur, when it comes to this tanur, which has a higher intensity of heat, afilu im husak bekashu givava, even if it's fueled with straw or stubble, which by a kira, we said, if you have a kira that's fueled with kasher givava, there's no isser of shehiyah, even if it's not grufa uktuma. Even if you didn't sweep out the coals, even if you didn't bank the coals, you're allowed to do shehiyah on a kira that's fueled with kasher givava. But by a tanur, afilu im husak bekasher givava, even if you fuel it with kasher givava that are not going to make coals, aser, shehiyah is aser, and not only is shehiyah aser, says the Mechaber, aser afilu lismoichloi. Shehiyah is aser, never mind shehiyah on the cooktop. Shehiyah is even aser to put a pot of food on the ground next to the tanur, and afilu imhu garafikotum. You see how chamor a tanur is? Shehiyah is aser on a tanur, even if it's garafikotum, even if you swept out whatever coals there are, even if you banked whatever flammable material there was inside, even if you fueled it with kashu givava, and even smicha is aser. Even putting a pot next to the tanur is aser. The Ramah qualifies this. Haggah says the Ramah, when is this true? Kolzman shahayat seledes by. Only if the heat of the tanur is yad seledes. If it's hot enough that your hand would jump away, approximately 100, somewhere between 104 degrees and higher, depending on the paiskim. But even as long as it's Yatze Ledes. If it's not Yatze Ledes, you can do what you want. If it's not Yatze Ledes, it's not hot enough to cook. If it's not hot enough to cook, then you could put on top, you could put next to it, you could do whatever. Continues the Mechaber. I just told you that Shehiyah is also by a Tanur, even if it's fueled with kasher givava, even if it's grufa uktuma, even only to be masmich, even to put a pot next to the tanur. Certainly it's aser to do shehiyah on top of the tanur or inside the tanur. So that's the halach of a tanur. A tanur, very chomer. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut l'chav beis. By a tanur, shehiyah is aser afilu imhu garuf, even if it's swept out of the coals. Now, right away, this is something that needs explanation. We said that by a kira, if it's garuf v'kotum, you're allowed to do shehiyah. Why? Because the whole iser of shehiyah is only because of a chash shema yechata b'gecholim. If it's garuf, if it's swept out, there are no gecholim. So what do you mean shema yechata b'gecholim? There are no gecholim. That's why by a kira, shehiyah is also mutter if you use kasher givava, because there are no gecholim. So how is it that over here by a tanur, we're saying that there's an iser of shehiyah, even if it's kasher givava, and even if it's garuf? I don't understand. If it's garuf, there's nothing to be machata. And if it's kasher givava l'chayr, there's nothing to be machata. So, says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut l'chaf beis, afilu imu garuf, there's an iser of shehiyah, even if you did grifa, even if you shoveled out whatever fuel there was. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, mipnei shehagoyref einoi goyref el roiv ha'esh atzma. When you do grifa, when you go ahead and you shovel out the coals, do you do a perfect job? You don't do a perfect job. You're not totally sweeping out the floor of the oven and making sure you get every spark and every little bit of flammable material out of there. You take a shovel and you shovel out roiv of the etzem fire. You shovel out where there's burning coals. You shovel it all out. It's not possible that you can do such a perfect job of grifa that you're not going to leave a little bit of burning embers. A nitzotz literally is a spark. But it doesn't mean a spark. It means some burning embers. Ubetanor shechumay rav. By a tanor, that because of its shape and construction, the heat is very intense. Chayshinon, we need to be concerned, shema yechate, that you might be mechate, you might stoke whatever leftover embers there are, kedei sheyevaru oisam hanitzotzots, so that those burning embers should fire up. So what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. The Mishnah Berurah is telling you, you know what the difference is between a tanur and a kira? The heat of a tanur is so intense that even if you fuel it with kasher givava, it's true, kasher givava doesn't make coals, but kasher givava does leave some burning embers. Even if you do grifa, even if you go ahead and you shovel it out, you sweep it out, there's still going to be some burning embers because a tanur is so hot and it retains so much heat. We're afraid, Shema Yechata, we're afraid that you might stoke up whatever embers there are, because in a tanur, even stoking up those few embers, that could be significant enough to accelerate the cooking process. By a kira, if you fueled it with kasher givava or you did grifa, you're not going to be mechate b'gecholim, because the kira doesn't retain enough heat that being mechate in those embers is going to make a difference. It's not going to do anything. But by a tanur that retains so much heat, it will be effective. And therefore we're afraid, shema yechata b'gecholim. Now, there is sort of an open loop over here. And that is like this. We've just explained why it is a chash of shema yechata b'gecholim by a tanur, even if it's grufa, and even if you fueled it with kasher givava. Because since the heat is so intense, you might be mechata whatever's there, and that will be helpful. But how about ketima? Why doesn't ketima take away the chash of shema yechata b'gecholim? We said that the reason ketima works by akira is because when you bank the coals with ash, you're doing a maisa that shows that you're not interested in the intense heat of the coals. Once you do a ma'aseh to show that you're not interested in the intense heat of the coals, we're not afraid you're going to do an about face and you're going to be mechata b'gecholim. So why isn't it the same thing by a tanur? Let's say you have a tanur. It's true, the heat is very intense. But if you do ketima, if you bank whatever fuel is in the tanur, why don't we say that now that you did a ma'aseh of ketima, there's no more kshash, shemi mechata b'gecholim? So the Pri Megadim attacks this question, and the answer that the Pri Megadim gives is very, very interesting. Pri Megadim says like this. He says, by a tanur, by a kira, if you bank the coals, there's only one reason to bank the coals. You're banking the coals, it means I don't want the heat. So you do a ma'aseh of ketima on a kira, we're not afraid anymore, shebi yechata b'gecholim. But by a tanur, where the heat is so intense, banking the coals is a regular part of the cooking process. Why? Because a tanur that has such intense heat, sometimes during the cooking process, you need to lower the flame, because otherwise the food is going to burn. So by a kira where the heat is more moderate, the only time you're going to do ketima is when you're saying, I don't want the heat anymore. I'm done with cooking. So then, if you do ketima and akira, there's no isser of shehiyah, because you just showed I'm not interested in cooking anymore. You're not going to go nabi mechata b'gecholim. But by a tanur, doing ketima, you see that the food is overheating, it might catch, it might burn, right away you do ketima. Then, it cools down a little bit, you shake the ash off, and you increase the flame. It's like a good old-fashioned charcoal grill. When you use a good old-fashioned charcoal grill, you're opening the vents, lowering the vents. So this is part of the process. So ketima is not a ma'aseh that shows that you're done. You might not be done. Now you did ketima, but 10 minutes from now you might want to stoke up the coals. So that's why the Pri Megadim says ketima is not effective. Continues the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Kat Chav Beis. Very funny line that the Mishnah Berurah is about to say. I don't really have a great explanation why he used the language that he used. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'hinei, Miloshan ha-mechaber mashma, from the language of the mechaber, it is mashma, which means it's implied, disfir like kedas HaTorah, that the mechaber holds like the Torah, that what? Ta'afilu b'kashu b'givava, that even if you fueled a tanur with kash and givava, osir b'gar fikotum, shehiyah is osir on a tanur, even if it's fueled with kash and givava, and even if it's gar fikotum. That's the Chavetz Chaim says the mechaber is mashma that way. Now the mechaber is not really mashma that way. The mechaber says it straight out. The mechaber says tanur afilu im husak bekashu ugivava aser va'afilu im ugar fekatum. Now I guess what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is theoretically there could be a comma, and it could be that the mechaber is addressing two different cases. One case is that there's an isser of shehiyah on a tanur even if it's fueled with kashu givava. Then there's another case. Shehiyah is aser on a tanur, even if it's garufikotum, and it was fueled with gefes and eitzim. But how about if you have tarti l'reisa? How about if you have two mitigating factors? How about if the tanur is fueled with kashu givava, and it's garufikotum? So the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here now, from the lashon of the mechaber, it's mashma. It's almost straight out, but you could declare such a shaila, but from the lashon of the mechaber, it's mashma, that even if you have both mitigating factors, it's fueled with kashu givava that don't make coals, and it's garfikotum. So whatever was there you swept out, it's still usr, it's still an isser of shehiyah. So says the Mishnah Berurah, that's the way the mechaber is mashma. And the Torah paskins that way. And it sounds like the mechaber is saying like the Torah. V'chein hu das harav Rabbi Yonasan, hamuva b'chidush Aran. Achein miloshan Rambam mashma. However, the Mishnah Berurah says that from the Rambam it's mashma, the bekashu begivava, that if you have a tanur that's fueled with kashu givava, einoi osir betanur, it's not osir by a tanur, ki im be'einoi garuf. But if you would have a tanur fueled with kashu givava, and it would be garuf, and you swept it out, then it would be mutter. V'cheinu das hakol boi v'chedush Aran, v'yesh lahakel bazeh. Okay, now the Ramah qualified the psak of the mechaber, and he said this isser of shehiyah by a tanur is only if it's yad seledes boy. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but if the heat of the tanner is not at the level of Yatzel Lettuce Boy, if you have a tanner that's cool, if you have a tanner that's not Yatzel Lettuce, so that means it's not hot enough to cook. If it's not hot enough to cook, you could put something on it, forget Shehiyah. You could put something on it even on Shabbos. The Mishnah Berurah says it's possible that even if it's not gar fekatum, if it's not Yatzel Lettuce, it can't cook. If it can't cook, you can't have an Issa Bishul. If it's not possible to have an Issa Bishul, so then you could put something on it even on Shabbos. Brings that down from the Magen Avram. Then the Mechaber said, if I'm telling you that it's usher to put a pot on the ground next to this tanner, to be masmich, certainly it's also to put something on it or in it. But realize, when we're talking about an Isser Shehiyah, either next to or on top of or inside a tanner, it's only if we're dealing with food that's either not mevushal kol tzarchai, or if it is mevushal kol tzarchai, if it is fully cooked, it's still mitztamik v'yafaloi. That's the only time that we could have a problem of shehiyah, because that's the only time we could have gzeira shemi yechata b'gacholim. But if it's fully cooked and it's mitztamik v'raloi, then there can't be an issa shehiyah even by a tanner. Avam mitztamik v'raloi mutter. V'chein b'kterech hayasa. Also, if you have a pot of totally raw food, like we said by Akira, if it's a pot of totally raw food, there can't be an issa shehiyah, because you're not going to be mechata b'gacholim, because you're b'siach das, you have no expectation to use that food Friday night. Okay, so we go weiter in the Mechaber now, 3 lines down. So far we've discussed a kira. So the kira is the larger oven with room for 2 pots on top. We've discussed a tanur, which has that angled shaped, so it traps the heat inside, and the heat is very intense. Now we go to another contraption. Says the Mechaber, v'kupach. How about a kupach? What's a kupach? Says the Mechaber, Shu Mokam Shvisas Kedera Achas. A kupach is basically a miniature kira. A kira is big enough that the stovetop area has room for 2 pots. A kupach is built the same way as a kira. It's not angled at the top the way a tanner is. The walls are straight, but it's smaller than a tanner. It only has room for 1 pot on top. Now, the kupach is a middle area. Why? The kira, because of its size and shape, the heat is the most moderate. The tanur, because it's angled at the top, the heat is the most intense. The kupach, it's not intense like the tanur, because it's not narrow at the top. It's not as cool as a kira, because it's smaller than a kira. And since it's smaller than a kira, the heat builds up more. So it's a middle ground, the kupach, and therefore the halacha of the kupach is a middle ground. I just should mention that everything that we're saying over here is still all the Deya Rishona, the first opinion that the Mechaber is bringing down here in Siman Reish Tun Gimel Sif Aleph. This is the Machmir opinion. These are the Rishonim that paskim like the Chachamim, not like Chananya. These are the Chachamim that are Machmir when it comes to Shehiyah. And that's the Deya Rishona of the Mechaber, to paskin like the Rambam and the Rif, who say that we paskin like the Chachamim in the Machlokes Chachamim and Chananya. The Deya Shniya, which we'll start seeing Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow, is more kuludik. Everything we're saying so far is in the Deya Rishona of the Mechaber. So the kupach, this kupach, says the Mechaber, shehu mokam shvisas ktera achas, which is a contraption that only has room on the stovetop for 1 pot. So now it depends. Im husak bekash uigiveva, if you fuel it with straw or stubble, dinoi kikira, then it has the din of a kira. Okay, what's the din of a kira? Well, the din of a kira is if it's fueled with kasher giveva that don't make coals, then shehiyah is mutter, right? Even if the food is only partially cooked, even if it's not garuf v'kotum, because it's kasher giveva. There can't be achshash shemi yechata b'gecholim. There's nothing to be mechata. So the kupach has a din of a kira if it's fueled with kasher giveva. Remember, kasher givava is a mitigating factor. It doesn't become coals. So there's nothing to be mechata. So by a kupach, same din as a kira. You fuel it with kasher givava. There's nothing to be mechata. There's no issa shehiyah. If there's no issa shehiyah, you could even put food that's partially cooked. Even if it's not mavushal kol tzarchai, you could put it on before Shabbos and allow it to stay there on Shabbos because there's no gzeri shabi echata. But begefes u be'etzim. But if the kupach is fueled with gefes or eitzim, that makes gecholim, so there is room for a gzeri shabi echata begecholim, then dinoi ketanur. Then it has the halacha of a tanur, and then shehiyah is aser, even not only on top of the kupach or inside the kupach. She is also even on the ground next to the kupach, and it's also even if it's gar fekatum. So you see how we're treating the kupach? On the one hand, we're machmer by the kupach because it's small, it builds up more heat. So a kupach that's fueled with gefes and eitzim, then shehiyah is aser, even on the ground next to it, even if it's gar fekatum. So it's more chamer than a kira. It's treated like a dana. If it's fueled with kasher givava, then we're makel. Then we treat it like a kira. If it's fueled with kasher givava, then we say, no problem, it's like a kira. There's no isashi at all, because there's nothing to be mechate. Says the Ramah, va'atanurim shalanu. Remember, this is the Ramah speaking back in the Ramah's days. Va'atanurim shalanu, the Ramah said, our tanurs are dinam kikira. What we call a tanur, said the Ramah, has the din of a kira. Okay, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton chav hey. Shehu mokaim. The kupach has room on top for one pot. Who also gain kira. This is built like a kira. Ella the kira who mokaim shvisa shteik teros. But a kira is bigger. It has room for two pots on top. The kupach who mokaim shvisas ketera achas. The kupach is smaller. It only has room for one pot. Lefikach nafish havle. Because it's smaller, it builds up more heat. Mikira than a kira. Shamokaim tsar. Because it's small. And therefore the heat builds up inside it to a greater degree. V'zuter havle midatanor, but it has less heat than a tanor. The Mechaber said, if it's fueled with kashu givava, then dinai kikira. Then it gets the halacha of a kira. What's the halacha of a kira? Va'afil loy garaf es hakash v'loy katam. Even if you didn't sweep out the kashu, the givava, and you didn't bank it, you're still allowed to be masha. You're still allowed to do shehiyah because there can't be exer shabi yechata b'gecholim, and you could do it even with partially cooked food. But if it's fueled with geves and eitzim, dino ketanor. Then it has the din of a tanor. Shafilu garaf ekotam, even if it's grufa uketuma, aser bein b'soicha, bein agaba, bein bismicha. The Ramah said, tanurim shalanu. Our tanurim, said the Ramah, they're not treated as chamer as a tanur. They're treated more kal. They're treated like a kira. Why? Why were the tanurim in the days of the Ramah treated like a kira? So the Mishnah Berurah explains, tanurim shalanu, shepiyah min atzad, because the doors were in the side. V'oid, sherechav b'yoser, and also they're bigger, and ein chumam rav kol kach, v'alkein dinoi kikira, since they had doors in the side that would let out a lot of heat, and since they were built bigger than the standard issued tanurim, I guess in the times of the Mechaber, the times of the Mishnah, so they're more kal, they built up less heat, and they were treated like a kira. The Tiferes Shmuel brings down in the name of Marshal that he disagreed with this psak. The Chavetz Chaim says certainly by bakers' ovens, shamasikid by tadir, that are running 24 hours a day, v'chumay rav, they build up a tremendous amount of heat. Toiv lahachmer l'dunoi ketaner, you should be machmer to treat it like a tanner. I know that the matzah bakery that I bake in, they told me that when they finish baking before the Zman on Erev Pesach, when they finish the Erev Pesach matzahs, they slam the doors of the ovens, they run out. The bakery is sold completely for Pesach because there's dough and everything. So the whole thing is sold for Pesach. They walk out. They come back after Pesach. The oven is still hot. Remember, those ovens had been burning since before Hanukkah. They've been baking matzahs, day in, day out, day in, day out. Every night before they leave, they fill it up with coal and wood. So the oven's been running like that for months and months and months and months and months. After a whole Pesach, the oven is still hot. So says the Chavetz Chaim, you have the ovens of the Nachtoimen, the ovens of the commercial bakeries. Those are very hot, and they should be treated like a tanur. Now everybody's wondering, what's the din of our ovens? We're going to get there. First, we got to go through, like I said, this is all the day of Rishona. We got to go through the day of Shnia. Then we could first talk about the halacha lamaisa of shehiyah by our ovens and our stovetops. Okay, so now we're 4 lines off the bottom here in Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, near the end of the line in the Mechaber, V'im shachach v'shah. So the Mechaber has described to us very well the Isser of shehiyah, the Isser of leaving food on the stovetop, in the oven, sometimes next to the tanur, to leave food there on Erev Shabbos and allow it to remain there on Shabbos. And the underpinning of the whole Issa D'Rabbanan is this concern, Shema Yechata B'Gechalim, that you might come to stoke the fire, be over on Havara, be over on Bishul. Okay, so we see where it's Aser, we see where it's Mutter. Let's say you had a case where it's Aser. So you had mamish partially cooked food. It's not mavushal kol tzarchai. Or it's mavushal kol tzarchai, but it's mitztamik v'yafalai. You have a kira. It's fueled with gefes and eitzim. It's not garfikotum. You don't have a blech. And it's not swept out. So you have a perfect storm. And now you have an Isser Shehiyah. But you goofed. You forgot. You forgot that there's an Isser Shehiyah. And you left the food on the stovetop on Erev Shabbos. Now you come home after davening Friday night. Oy vey, I did shehiyah. So what's the halacha? What's the status of that food? Says the Mechaber, v'im shachach v'shah. If you forgot and you did shehiyah, you accidentally left the pot on the stovetop. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the simple understanding of the Mechaber is that you just forgot. You meant to take the pot off the fire. You forgot. You left it there. Now you came home from shul, and it's still there. What's the status of the food? But the Mishnah Berurah says this covers another case too. V'im shachach v'shah, v'chol shkedim shagag bedin. Or you made a halachic mistake. Let's say you had food that was mavushal kol tzarchai, but it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. So you thought to yourself, oh, it's mavushal kol tzarchai. It's fully cooked. I'm allowed to do shehiyah. There's no concern shema yechata b'gechalim. But you forgot. Wait a second. I'm talking about cholent. I'm talking about brisket. It's mitztamik v'yafaloi. I forgot that mitztamik v'yafaloi there is an Isser Shehiyah. So now it's not that you forgot and you meant to take the food off and accidentally you left it there. No, you made a mistake in halacha. You thought the halacha was that this shehiyah is mutter, but you goofed. Really, this shehiyah is aser. Now the Mishnah Berurah says that the halacha that we're going to say now, kol shkein, it applies to the first case where you accidentally left the food there. Kol shkein, it applies to the case where you made a mistake in din. Let's see what the halacha is first. Says the Mechaber, v'b'shachach v'shah. You forgot and you left the food there. Says the Mechaber, it depends. Im hu tavshel shabishal kol tzarchai. If the food is fully cooked, mutter, you're allowed to eat the food. Afilu hu mitztamik v'yafaloi. Here, it was aser to do shehiyah because it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. But you didn't do shehiyah intentionally. You forgot. You accidentally left the pot there. Says the Mechaber, if it's fully cooked, if it's mavushal kol tzarchai, then you're allowed to eat that food, even if it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Eis kat lamed. Afilu imu mitztamik v'yafa, v'afilu b'soich hatanur. Even if it's the worst possible case, you didn't put it on top of the kira, you put it inside the kira where it's even hotter. V'atam, what's the rationale here? Why is this food mutter? D'lo nena mimenu kol kach. Because even though it's true that this food was mitztamik v'yafaloi, how much benefit are you getting from the fact that you accidentally were over on the Issa D'Rabbanan of shehiyah? It's not. You're not benefiting that the food was inedible and now it's edible. The food was fully edible. It was mavushal kol tzarchai. You got epis, it cooked in a little bit more. So you got the mitztamik v'yafaloi. We're not going to consign you. Let's realize, if we're going to say that you can't eat the food, why can't you eat the food? Why can't you eat the food? If it was mavushal kol tzarchai, you didn't do bishul on Shabbos. You can't do bishul on something that's mavushal kol tzarchai. Also, you didn't put the food on the fire on Shabbos. You put the food on the fire before Shabbos. Remember the halacha of Reish Nun Beis. You could put food on a fire before Shabbos and allow bishul to take place on Shabbos. You're not over this of bishul. So, what would the rationale be to asa the food? The answer is, based on a Gemara in Shabbos, the rationale would be a knas. We're giving you a penalty. Since you goofed and you forgot and you were over in Issa D'Rabbanan, we would penalize you. But we're not going to penalize you and asa the food, where the only benefit that you got from transgressing the Issa D'Rabbanan of She'iyah was mitztamik v'yafaloi. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says here. So, the food was eminently edible. Was fully cooked. But now let's go back into the Mishnah Berurah. But 3 lines from the bottom near the end. But if that food was not mavushal kol tzarchai when Shabbos came in, it wasn't edible. Maybe it was ma'achal b'drusai. The words of the Mechaber, it wasn't mavushal kol tzarchai. If when Shabbos came in, it wasn't mavushal kol tzarchai, aser ad motzai Shabbos. Then we penalize you, and then the food is aser until Motzei Shabbos. What does that mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah's Kat Lamed Beis, Ad Motzei Shabbos, Ba'agas Ashri Bavur, the Gam Bekanu B'chtei Sheyeyase. When we say it's aser until Motzei Shabbos, it means it's aser for the amount of time that it would take for whatever cooking took place on Shabbos, the amount of time for that cooking to take place after Shabbos is over. After that amount of time passes, that's when it becomes mutter. Kamoi ba'arvar v'shah, which we're going to see is the halacha, if not you were shachach, if not that you forgot, if you intentionally were over the Isser Shehiyah. Okay. So, if it was not mavushal kol tzarchai, aser ad motzai Shabbos. Then it's aser until motzai Shabbos. So here we have the halacha, if you goofed when it came to Shehiyah. If you were a shoygig, if you were shachach, you forgot. So it depends. If the food was mavushal kol tzarchai, we're not going to penalize you. If, however, it was not mavushal kol tzarchai, then we're going to penalize you and we're going to asa the food until after b'chtei sheyeyaseh on Motzei Shabbos. One more halacha here. Hagah says to Ramah. No. V'im avar v'shah. A little bit of Mechaber left. V'im avar v'shah. Let's say you didn't forget. Let's say, chas v'chalila, somebody intentionally did Shia when it was aser. He had a Yetzara. He wanted to make sure he had good food Friday night, so he went ahead and he did Shia when he wasn't allowed to. V'im avar v'shah aser b'shneim. If you were over and you went ahead and did Shia, then it's aser, even if it was mavushal kol tzarchai. It's still aser. Says the Ramah Hagah, ad b'chtei sheyeyasu, where we say it's aser till Motzei Shabbos, we mean for the amount of time ad b'chtei sheyeyasu. V'im hechziram ein Yehudi b'Shabbos, continues the Ramah. How about if what happened over here was you didn't do anything? You had the pot sitting on the kitchen counter, and the Ein Yehudi came, and the Ein Yehudi did Shia. The Ein Yehudi is the one who put it on the fire, and you didn't tell him to. He did it of his own volition. Now what's the halacha? Are you allowed to use the food? Says the Ramah, if an Ein Yehudi put the k'dera, put the pot on the fire on Shabbos, on Erev Shabbos, not on Shabbos. If the Ein Yehudi put the food on the fire on Erev Shabbos, and he did Shehiyah, dinoi k'shachach v'shah, so then the halacha is the same as the case where Yisrael did the Shehiyah inadvertently. So what's the halacha? If the Ein Yehudi took the pot on Erev Shabbos and he put it on the fire and he did Shehiyah, and you come home and you say, how did the pot get on the fire? This was mavushal kol tzarchai, but it was mitztamik v'yafaloi. Or it wasn't mavushal kol tzarchai. Shehiyah was aser. How did it get on the fire? Oh, the Ein Yehudi put it on the fire. So then the halacha is as if you did it yourself, but it was shachach v'shah. What's the halacha? The halacha is, if it was mavushal kol tzarchai, you're allowed to eat the food, even if it's mitztamik v'yafaloi. But if it wasn't fully cooked, and the Ein Yehudi put it on, and now it became cooked on Shabbos, then the food is aser until Motzai Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lam Gimel, on the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, Hechziram Eini Yehudi L'Tzarech Yisrael. If the Eini Yehudi put it on the fire and did Shehiyah for the benefit of the Yid, so then Ois Katan Lam Daled Dina Keshachach, it gets the same halacha as if you did it yourself, but you did it inadvertently. You forgot. The Masha Nasal Yidei Eini Yehudi B'Mezid, because the action of the Eini Yehudi with intent, the mazid action of the Eini Yehudi, loy chamor, is not going to be treated more stringently mimasha nasal yidei Yisrael b'shoigeg than what a yid did, but he did it b'shoigeg v'alkein, and therefore afilu im mitztamik v'yafaloi, if it's mavushal called tzarchai, but it's still mitztamik v'yafaloi, mutter. You'll still be mutter. You'll still be allowed to eat that food. Kevichin is partial called tzarchai ve'einenu mimenu kol kach, since you didn't get such a high degree of benefit from the fact that the food was sitting on the flame on Shabbos. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua the first parnasa shetukim to all those in need. We should be zoichet to see the BS called Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.